On today's History of Politics, I want to talk to you about the concept of politicization, or in other words, taking certain events and making them political. Now, let's be understanding of a difference here. What government does isn't politics. What government is supposed to do is govern. How do they govern? It's an organization. It makes organization of things by way of laws. Okay? It's not per se focused on control, but it is a way to establish norms and controls. Politics is something different. Politics is more of a game than anything else. And it's a game that Donald Trump loves to play. He loves to play politics. And it's really a waste of time. Where we could be doing things to benefit the people of our country, we're wasting it on playing political games and bullshit. A good example of this recently was the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And I'm going to put my 2 cents in here and say, number one, I don't believe that Tyler Robinson killed that boy. B, I don't believe that it was done with the weapon they claimed. C, I do know that Charlie Kirk was working on trying to get the Epstein files released to the public, which is something that Trump desperately does not want. D, I know that narcissist personalities are focused on only themselves, and anybody else that gets hurt to protect themselves is just collateral damage. No big thing. Lives could be thrown away in the narcissist's view. Not lives to protect him are worth throwing away. But let's talk about the politicization of Charlie Kirk's death. I've said it in the last 5 or 6 days. I had to have said this at least 1,000 times. And here's what it is. Under no circumstances, should anyone consider taking a life unless their own life, the lives of their family, or their possessions are being threatened. That's what the text of the Second Amendment says in the Constitution. It says that we are allowed to keep and bear arms for the protection of ourselves, our possessions, and our families. Under no circumstance should you consider taking a life because somebody says something that you don't agree with. Now, I know some of the MAGAs have even thought about killing me. If I had a larger platform, I'm sure I'd have to wear a bulletproof vest probably. Because there's some people, and this is something that you have to take into account. I'm sorry. We all have a First Amendment right, but there are some people that are going to take it to an extreme. Constitutionally, there was a case from 1919 called Schenck versus the United States. It was a Supreme Court case. And what it clearly was about was that free speech is protected. This case established what was called the clear and present danger theorem. Okay, the clear and present danger theorem. And what that did was, what it's basically saying is that, yes, you do have a right to free speech and it's protected by law, but if that free speech causes a clear and present danger, or there's a potential of it happening, then it's not protected by law. And I'm sorry to tell you this, but if you want to think of it in basic terms, you cannot go into a movie theater a packed movie theater and scream fire when there is no fire? Because people get trampled and so on. You know, if there is a fire, people stampede to get out of there to save their lives. Somebody gets trampled. They find out you're the one that put the alarm out. You cannot be criminally charged for that person's death or injury. But if it occurred that there was no fire and you scream fire, and in the process of people fleeing, somebody or several people get hurt or killed, and they find out you're the one that set the alarm in the first place, then you can be held legally responsible for that. Now let's take it to Charlie Kirk for a second. Charlie Kirk, and yes, I'm going to say this, and if you want to get mad enough to kill me, then we haven't learned anything. Here's what it comes down to. Charlie Kirk said some very incendiary things. And yes, I would go as far as to say they were wrong because they were unproven. They're not held as fact. They're opinion in my book. And in most books, they're opinion. Charlie Kirk would say things that Martin Luther King wasn't a good guy. Martin Luther King never hurt a fly. But you're saying he was not a good guy. You're saying that if you get on a plane and the pilots are black, you get nervous because they're not smart enough to fly planes. You're taking a perfectly good job away from a white man by hiring these people. You're saying that black women cannot process information like white men can. He's saying that people like Ketanji Brown Jackson, Michelle Obama, who has not one, two Juris Doctor degrees. Ketanji Brown Jackson, who has a Juris Doctor degree. These people are not qualified. They're DEI hires, which they even got the Republicans have the definition of DEI wrong. They confuse DEI with equal opportunity. Equal opportunity is an old program. It doesn't exist anymore. DEI is not its replacement. You're trying to say that they took jobs through DEI that should have rightfully gone to white men. Hey, fellas, you don't know everything. And neither did Charlie Kirk. And here's my point. When you have a large platform like that and you say that kind of claptrap and garbage that you have no scientific proof whatsoever to back up, you created a clear and present danger. At the very least, the potential of it. Now, here's where it gets politicized. Because the politicians use that as a means to an end. What do I mean by that? Before a shooter was clearly identified, way before that happened, Donald Trump goes on the air and he says that it was a radical leftist and a Democrat. And because Charlie Kirk had such a large following in the MAGA community, all of a sudden, they're screaming, they want war, it's war. So you just turn one faction against another. Instead of bringing in peace, you divided. To what end? So you could conquer. Because you got to understand what Donald Trump is about. Donald Trump is about consolidating power, and he knows the formula. He has been trying for several months now to incite a civil war. Why do you want to incite a civil war? Here's what happens. Civil war comes, you start out by declaring a national emergency, because a civil war, if one state's fighting against another, or you've got widespread fighting against each other, you could declare a national emergency. Once you've done that, the second step is you declare martial law. Now, national emergency already unlocked a slew of presidential powers that override other branches of the government. But then you follow that up. You follow that up by declaring martial law. Now you're grabbing control of the reins. In other words, you just effectively neutered the Congress. You've neutered the law. Now you became the chief lawmaker. And lastly, you suspend habeas corpus. Bow! When you did that, now you just neutered the courts. There's no more rights for people. You've neutered the courts. And that, my friends, is how you take all of the power to yourself. You consolidate power unto yourself. Then you've got everything you want. And that's when the United States becomes the Fourth Reich. Let that sink in. That is when the United States becomes the Fourth fucking Reich. Politicization, or politicization, if you will. Charlie Kirk was not a political figure. He was an activist, as they say, but he was not a member of Congress. He was not the president. He was not part of the congressional system. He was not part of the government system. He was not in the military. But you made him the focus of politics. Now, sometimes politicization is good, right? In New Jersey, there was a young girl, 7 years old, that was kidnapped, raped, and murdered by a convicted felon who was previously in jail for the same crime, a sex offender. And the evolution of that murder that happened in, I believe, 1990 or 91, I believe, I could be wrong, turned into what's called Megan's Law, which came out in 1997. Took effect in 1997. The politicians ran on it that they would pass Megan's Law. And that's how the politicians got into place, because they said that we will pass Megan's Law. It was something that the public wanted. Megan had nothing to do with government. She wasn't even a political activist. She was an innocent victim. But politicians, people that were running for government positions, or people in government trying to keep their position, took this issue and turned it into a political issue. Here's the whole thing in a nutshell. When we politicize things that we shouldn't, it causes a problem. Donald Trump politicized Charlie Kirk, his killing. As there were some politicians that politicized George Floyd's murder. And okay, there's a way to do it, and there's a way not to do it. When you get to a point where you're sending masses out knowing that they're going to hurt other people, that's a problem. And that's something that the court said we cannot do. But Donald Trump doesn't care. Donald Trump is a rogue. He's a criminal. And yeah, I've known long enough. For a long time, he's been that way. Ever since he got with Roy Cohn, he's been nothing but a goddamn criminal. Because Roy Cohn was a criminal. Couldn't even admit that he was gay, but he died from AIDS. And that's because he went around calling everybody else queers and faggots and blackmailed some people like that. But he was chief among them. Just a thought. If you learned something today, respectfully comment, like, and share. I'll see you on the next one.